Story recapped here. Today I'm going to explain a fantasy, horror, and mystery film called Dagon. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. As a deep-sea diver explores the ocean, he discovers a mysterious and majestic underwater structure. Curious, he swims closer to it and observes it keenly. However, the diver is taken by surprise when an alluring woman appears in front of him. She looks at the driver with a smile on her face, and he soon realizes that she's a mermaid. The mermaid then swims towards the diver and takes off his swimming goggles, and then she suddenly lets out a deafening screech, revealing her razor-sharp teeth. Moments later, Paul wakes up and realizes he's just had a nightmare. He is sweating and bothered since he's been having the same dream for days now. Paul's girlfriend, Barbara, wakes up too and kisses him for reassurance before trying to give him a good time. However, Paul isn't in the mood for that. This then upsets Barbara, and so Paul just opens his laptop to check on their stocks. Instead of enjoying his vacation on a boat off the coast of Spain, Paul just can't stop worrying about his work. Frustrated, Barbara grabs the laptop and throws it out to the sea. As expected, Paul freaks out and the two start arguing. Meanwhile, Paul's business partner, Howard, and his wife, Vicky, simply watch them in amusement. Suddenly, Barbara hears a faint singing from a nearby village. Howard thinks it's because of a religious festival, and after hearing it, Vicky decides to go below deck to freshen up. Then, giant clouds start to roll in, and as the sky darkens, they soon realize that there's a storm coming. Howard tries his best to steer everyone to safety, but the big waves push their boat sideways and they hit a giant rock. Meanwhile, Vicky gets her legs stuck between the boat and the rock, screaming in agony. So, the three quickly come to her rescue, but they can't get her out. They then signal for help from the nearby village, but when they get no response, Paul and Barbara decide to take the rescue boat and head to the village themselves. Unfortunately, something bumps into their rescue boat and causes a tear to it. Water then starts to leak in, so they try their best to get to the village fast. On the other hand, Howard and Vicky are already soaked in seawater and oil. Vicky is also excessively bleeding, and she suddenly feels something move in the water. She starts to freak out, but they can't see what's in the water because of the thick oil spill. Then, to their horror, the water starts gurgling, so Howard blindly shoots with his gun to kill whatever is threatening them. Paul and Barbara hear the gunshot, but they can't go back even if they want to. It doesn't help that their boat is damaged and the motor has just died. So they quickly paddle their way to the dock, and by sheer luck, they make it in time. After that, they both search the town, but it seems abandoned. Suddenly, Barbara hears the singing voices from earlier, so they decide to follow them. The voices lead them to the church, where Paul sees a familiar symbol on the entrance and remembers it from his dream. They then bang on the doors, begging to be let in, but they realize that they're already open. At first, they can't find anyone, but a priest soon shows up, wondering what the couple needs. Once the priest learns about their situation, he pairs Paul with a few strange-looking boatmen to rescue Howard and Vicky. Meanwhile, Barbara stays in the village to find a doctor and inform the police of what happened. She tries to make a phone call, but there's no signal, so the priest tells her to go to the Hotel del Mar, where there's a working telephone. But as the priest points to where the hotel is, Barbara is surprised to see that he has webbed fingers. However, she plays it cool, and she quickly makes her way to the hotel. On her way there, Barbara notices the weird-looking and pale villagers who are making growling noises and walking in a limping manner. Horrified, Barbara starts running until she finally reaches the hotel. As she approaches the front desk, she finds the receptionist and asks him if she could make a call. However, he doesn't respond, so she initiates to do it herself. But the receptionist stops her and they get into a physical fight. Then, suddenly, the priest arrives, so Barbara asks for his help. Unfortunately, the priest helps the receptionist in attacking and strangling Barbara. At the same time, Paul finds that Vicky and Howard are no longer in the boat. All that's left is Vicky's yellow towel, which she wore earlier. When they return to the village, the priest tells Paul that Barbara is at the hotel. Paul quickly goes to the hotel and speaks to the receptionist, but the old man doesn't entertain him, so he gives up and just settles into booking a room. Paul also notices the gills on the side of the receptionist's neck, but he keeps quiet about it. Then, when Paul gets to his room, he sees how disgustingly dirty the place is, and nothing is functional. Frustrated and exhausted, Paul just sits in a chair. Then, out of nowhere, Barbara enters the room and Paul expresses how glad he is that she's back. However, as she turns to face Paul, it's not really Barbara, but the mermaid he saw in his dream. She then lets out a loud screech and tentacles come out of her mouth. Seconds later, Paul wakes up and realizes that it's just another dream. Outside, Paul finds that the villagers are gathering under the rain and making weird animalistic noises. One of the villagers points at Paul and they all go mad when they see him. Scared, Paul quickly closes the windows and creates a lock for his door to stop the villagers from getting to him. Unfortunately, this proves to be pointless in the end. The villagers eventually break into his room, leaving Paul with no choice but to jump out the window. Paul lands on a glass roof and ends up in the tannery where he desperately hides from the villagers. There, he finds human skins and discovers the remains of Howard. He then escapes the tannery by setting it on fire and later bumps into an old drunkard named Ezekiel, the last full-blooded human in the village. Ezekiel explains that Barbara and Vicky are dead. Then he unveils the history of Imboka, which is the village's name. Many years ago, when everyone was normal and Ezekiel was just a little boy, the village thrived on fishing. However, there came a time when there were no more fish to catch. This drove the people of Imboka to gather in the church and pray together. Then, in the middle of the mass, an intimidating seafarer named Kambaro barged in and told the villagers to pray to an ancient sea god, Dagon, instead of God, saying Dagon would give them more fish. The people didn't believe him, so they drove him out of the church. However, a few people trusted Kambaro, and later that night, they summoned Dagon by performing black magic. Soon, Dagon showered the village with a bountiful catch and plenty of gold. The locals then destroyed their church and the religious statues to make way for their new god. Kambaro also gained so much recognition that the people hailed him as the high priest, even after he killed the previous one. Unfortunately, when Dagon stopped giving them gold, the villagers began sacrificing people to please their new god. Ezekiel's parents protested against Kambaro's heretical practices, so they were immediately killed in front of everyone. Although Paul is not entirely buying Ezekiel's story, he rolls with it so he can have assistance in stealing the only functional car in Imboka. They then head to the mayor's manor, where Ezekiel creates a diversion so Paul can steal the vehicle. However, as Paul hotwires the engine, the horn goes off, leaving him with no choice but to run into the manor and hide. He eventually finds himself in a room with the mermaid that he keeps on seeing in his dream. Seconds later, the village leader and grandson of Kambaro, Xavier, almost enters the room but stops by the doorway. He then talks to the woman, who keeps quiet about Paul's presence and pretends everything's fine. Once Xavier is gone, the woman introduces herself as Ushia and tells Paul that she's been waiting for him. They start becoming intimate, but Paul doesn't get far and freaks out when he sees her gills and horrendous tentacle legs. Terrified, Paul flees despite Ushia's plea for him to stay. On his way out, Paul fights the chauffeur and manages to kill him. He also successfully steals the car, but he doesn't get far when he crashes it. After trying his best to fight off the villagers, Paul eventually gets caught and knocked out. Moments later, he wakes up in a barn where he finds Barbara, Vicky, and Ezekiel. Paul wonders why Ezekiel told him Vicky and Barbara were dead, so the old man says it's because he knew they'd suffer a fate worse than death. They then learn that Vicky has been impregnated by Dagon, but they are not sure whether she's telling the truth or just hallucinating. After that, they try to fight for their freedom, but they fail to do so. Unfortunately, Vicky can no longer go on, so she decides to kill herself by stabbing her stomach. The villagers separate Barbara from Paul and Ezekiel. The two men get chained up in a small room where Paul tries to buy their way out. However, the village is rich with gold and artifacts, so the priest tells him that his wealth means nothing. All they want is a sacrifice for their god, Dagon, and the villagers hold Ezekiel as the priest prepares to kill him. Feeling guilty, Paul turns to Ezekiel and apologizes for dragging him into the situation. But instead of getting mad, Ezekiel thanks Paul for helping him remember his parents, who died resisting Dagon and the cult. The priest then proceeds to peel the skin off Ezekiel's head, and as he's being flayed alive, Paul recites the 23rd Psalm with him until he passes away. And if that isn't enough, the priest walks closer to Paul and prepares to flay him too. Then, suddenly, Ushia shows up and saves Paul's life, telling him that he'll understand everything soon. Paul promises to do anything Ushia wants as long as they let Barbara go, but the woman says Barbara must bear Dagon's child. She then calls the priest to arrange her union with Paul, but once she leaves, Paul escapes and kills the priest along with the two guards. He also grabs a can of kerosene before looking for Barbara in the church, where he finds a secret passage that leads to a worship chamber. Meanwhile, Ushia is preparing Barbara in the worship chamber to become an offering to Dagon. After they strip Barbara down and chain her by the wrists, Ushia eagerly mutilates her body. The villagers then lower her down to a deep pit that leads to the sea, chanting as they wait for Dagon. Moments later, Paul arrives and quickly springs into action by dousing the villagers with kerosene and setting them on fire. On the other hand, Barbara gets submerged into the water, and although Paul manages to pull her back up, she asks him to kill her because Dagon has already impregnated her. However, Paul refuses to do what Barbara wants and reassures her that he'll get her out. Unfortunately, as he pulls her closer, Dagon jumps out of the pit and pulls Barbara into the water, severing her arms. Then, the remaining villagers and Xavier start beating Paul without mercy. However, Ushia intervenes and reveals that Paul is the long-lost son of Xavier, explaining the markings on his body and the dreams he's been having about her. She also adds that many years ago, Paul's human mother left Mboka after being impregnated by his half-breed father. Now that Paul has returned, Ushia wants him to accept his fate and become her lover. Filled with shock and shame, Paul decides to douse himself with kerosene before setting himself on fire. He then screams in pain, but Ushia grabs him and jumps into the water where he starts growing gills. Now that he can breathe underwater, Paul finally accepts his fate and swims willingly with Ushia.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.